In 2019, I received some unexpected money and I chose to go on a photographic road trip across the USA. Inside my hired RV, I had my camera, my computer, and a little bit of money in my pocket, and that was all I needed. It turned out to be one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Photographically, I was interested in exploring how the reality of present-day America stands up against my youthful perceptions of the country. Like so many other people around the world, I grew up immersed in American pop culture. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer size of the country and also by the photographic possibilities that it offers. I've been influenced by so many American photographers from Edward Weston, Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, also William Eggleston, Stephen Shaw, and many others. I know their imagery so well, and stacked on top of that are 100 cowboy movies, Dirty Harry, When Harry Met Sally, and 100 more crushes on American actresses. So my challenge was, how do I set some boundaries that would give me the freedom to really explore what was around me, but without becoming just another cliched clone? So I allowed myself to be drawn by the iconic American ideas and images that are archived in my head. I recognized that I was looking at them as an informed outsider. So the project was a way of giving form to my partial picture of the USA. And for this reason, I called the project America Revisited. While I was driving about, I took 8mm like videos. I wanted to mirror how my early imaginings of the US were more like home movies than solid photographs or films. I flew to Dallas and picked up my RV at the local depot. After a night recovering, I went to the site where John F. Kennedy had been shot. Even though the shooting had happened when I was 2 years old, I knew that this event was a significant moment within the world's history. It's impossible to compare the death of one man with that of 3,000, but in terms of events that have led to our collective loss of innocence, these two events might sometime in the future be considered as equivalent. I stood on the grassy slope above the X that marked the spot, and I wondered how I was going to photograph this scene, given that it is one of the most photographed places in the country. As a curious visitor or tourist visiting the spot, it's impossible to recreate the drama of the moment when the shooting happened. In the end, I chose this photograph in which all the participants are isolated from each other but also from the event itself. The boarded-up Baker Hotel in Mineral Wells is like so many other sites across America which at one stage boasted prosperity and now have been abandoned and have become monuments to the past. This hotel opened in 1922 and welcomed guests like Julie Garland, Ronald Reagan and Lyndon Johnson. The hotel faded in the 70s, and so did this city. This photograph was taken in the kitchen of a small apartment that was probably built for one of the workers at the hotel. Although abandoned, there were signs that people had recently been squatting in the apartment. The neat wallpaper and a few belongings are all that remain from those first occupants who had their hopes for the hotel, for the town, and for their own lives. There's such an amazing freedom that comes with doing this kind of photographic trip in an RV. You can work until sunset and then look around, and even the smallest towns have 2 or 3 parks to choose from. You can usually hire a spot for about $20 or $30, and after a long day of photographing you can hook up the sewerage, the electricity and water, and you're sitting outside having a drink 5 minutes later. I found Americans incredibly kind and respectful to me and to each other. It really seems that the polarization that one is aware of in the US is so much internet-based. My day-to-day experiences of Americans certainly didn't reflect the extremist views that one sees on social media. There was one American that really scared me, Ned. And Ned was only trying to be a nice guy. After one very long day of driving, I found my spot in an RV park, and I was trying to reverse my rig as expertly as I could. And suddenly out popped Ned. He was gesticulating and he was telling me, pull left, pull right. and then he appeared at my window, and he was just one of those guys who had no idea of personal space. He put his face right next to mine and then proceeded to tell me his life story within 2 minutes. I eventually got organized and connected to all the services, and as I was finishing off, I turned around and there was Ned again looking at me quietly, and then he launched off. "My wife would love to meet you. Come on over for a propane barbecue." You know that feeling when your heart really sinks and all you want to do is make some food, get into bed and go to sleep. Anyway, I didn't hang around long, and if that was the worst interaction I had in a month, then things aren't too bad. Ned was just being Ned. The US is just such a powerhouse of organization and production. I've been to a lot of countries around the world, and a lot of them are efficient, like Germany and Singapore, Japan, but there's an aspect of frontier-type ambition and innovation which really sets the country apart. I couldn't resist taking a look at Tombstone. That's where Brad Pitt, Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell hang out. It's really touristy, and 4 guys reenact the Battle of the OK Corral 3 times a day. In trying to avoid these sightseeing traps, I found a shooting alley, and the targets had a very graphic feel and brought home the violence that's associated with the town. Heading down to the Mexican border, I arrived in Nogales and temporarily got fixated by a cheap roadside motel called El Dorado. The heyday of these mom-and-pop type motels was around the middle of last century, but since then they've fallen out of favor. Photographers, however, haven't lost interest in these structures because they have a real element of nostalgia attached to them. They're associated especially with the 50s, when America was at its peak. It was a time in which long car holidays were popular, and families would stop off during their trip and spend the night in these motels. There's a reason why new topographic type photographers are so prolific in the United States. A lot of people seem completely happy to build things that outwardly have no obvious connection with the environment around them. And also, as I mentioned before, there's a tendency just to leave things and move on to the next thing. And it's probably very particular to the American way of life, where if something isn't working, don't hang about and waste your time. Just leave it and move on to something that really does work. So the American landscape is littered by weird objects and odd structures that don't quite fit in with the landscape around them. It seems to disturb some people, and they consider it to be landscape litter. But for me they add interest, and they're a bit like relics from the past. I suppose another explanation is that they are real eye candy to a photographer. One of the best examples of this is the Sultan Sea in California, and in particular Bombay Beach, which in the past used to be a really popular holiday destination. The Sultan Sea was formed in 1905 when the Colorado River floodwater breached an irrigation canal that was being constructed in the Imperial Valley. It only really lasted until the 70s, and then the water went bad, the fish died, and eventually everyone left. I know it's cliched, but I had to listen to U2's Joshua Tree when I drove through the town. While I was there, I found out about Giant Rock, which at one point had been considered to be the largest boulder in the world. But then, after a small bit split off, it just became your average big boulder. It's hard to resist a riches to rags story like that, so I headed off down a bumpy road to go have a look. When I arrived, all I could hear was the deep bass sounds of "This Is the End" by The Doors. It felt like I was being dragged into one of David Lynch's Twin Peaks episodes. I walked to the other side of the rock, and there I found a group who were obviously tripping very nicely because they had brought sofas and what looked like all their lounge furniture, and they were sitting comfortably under the rock. Things took a downward turn when they decided it was a good idea to shoot a movie, which involved a yellow bus, a naked woman, 2 shotguns, and a guy with a hula hoop. Unlike my friend Ned, who I spoke about earlier, I'm still in touch with Kathy and Kane, who I met there that day, and I've already been invited to the next party at Giant Rock. So many photographers have crisscrossed the continent and produced remarkable bodies of work. Robert Frank is probably the most famous of these, and his book The Americans, published in 1958, changed the way people look at America. Prior to this book, American photography was dominated by carefully constructed and beautifully printed photographs of Americana and sweeping majestic landscapes. And then along came Frank with his down and dirty pictures. Most of the reactions to his work at the time were negative, and Popular Photography magazine called the book a wart-covered picture of America by a joyless man. Another of my favorites is Gary Winogrand. It's interesting that working independently, Winogrand and Frank landed up taking a photograph of the same thing. It was a statue of St. Francis of Assisi in LA. I thought when I got there I'd try to track it down. The statue's been moved since that time and is now within a small park very close to Union Station. That area, just like much of LA, is filled with homeless people. So the whole time I was trying to get a photograph, I had a guy nattering unhinged stuff in my ear. This video has probably gone on for a bit too long, so what I'll do now is just have a slideshow of some of the images I took on the rest of the trip. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey, and please join me next time. Thanks.